Welcome back to the Environments for Fostering Effective Critical Thinking workshop. This next segment of the workshop is focused on the developmental framework. And before I move through the next few slides to describe the framework, I want to comment that what you will see here is different from the instructional framework. So the instructional framework, which is described in another segment of the workshop, is really focused on what these strategies look like in the classroom. So both to the teacher and to the students, what is the sequence of events that takes place over a series of classes as you're teaching through an effect. The developmental framework is different in that this is the framework to guide new adopters or developers of an effect into the steps that should be taken to create one before it becomes added to the classroom setting. So that's what you'll see as we go through the next few slides. And I think the most important comment for me to make at first to any new adopter is to think big but start small. In other words, there are multiple components of an effect, and it can be somewhat daunting or challenging to think about how all of those elements or components come together and the time that it might take to create all of those and link them together for a particular classroom setting can require a lot of time and effort. And so we really recommend that you start maybe with one component at a time and build on those. So for example, you could implement a decision worksheet, which is typically the first component of an effect, and just use that to generate some thought from students and student groups and to generate some discussion in a given class. And maybe that's the only element that you use the first time that you go through a newly developing effect. Or maybe it's identifying an active learning module, just one active learning session that correlates to one or two concepts, and just use that in a particular day's class. And as you go through each of these elements, of course, it gives you the opportunity to evaluate how well that particular component worked. So evaluating both the student performance and understanding and satisfaction with that element, but also your own self-assessment. So how well did this decision worksheet work? How well did this active learning module work in terms of trying to get across a particular understanding of a concept? So it's important to make those progressive evaluations as you develop an effect. And then as you do that, of course, you can start to integrate more elements or components in the next time you teach the course. So, for example, you could add a second active learning module that takes place on a consecutive days period and link those two together. And then over time, maybe you link those active learning modules and those embedded concepts associated with those modules, link those together with a decision worksheet. And ultimately, that leads to what we'll call a full or a complete effect. So the takeaway here is think big, think about the big picture of what you want to get across to the students, but just start slowly, start in a stepwise process. And remember, this slide shows up in an earlier portion of the workshop. Remember that the intention is to make these effects integrative. And really what we mean by that is focus on concepts or material that you are already teaching in this class. And how you identify those concepts is up to you. Maybe they're particularly challenging concepts or just the most important concepts, or whatever reasons you might have for identifying those. Choose those first. Use material that you're already teaching. Now you can take those concepts and start packaging them with active learning modules, and then linking those active learning modules together with a decision worksheet and some post-assessment, like a final report or some design product. And so that's really the intent here, is to not require you to be adding new material or new content, just that you're coming up with a different way of presenting that content to your students. And so what I want to walk you through now is the framework that we are proposing to new adopters to follow to create a particular effect. And so I'm going to work through multiple steps of the process. And keep in mind, from what I was saying before, that these are steps that can be done over a period of time. In other words, you could do the first 2 steps maybe for one particular course offering one semester, and then you progress on to, say, step 3 the next time you teach the course. So these are not steps that have to be done all in one sitting, if you will, or all in one developmental stage. This can be done over a period of time. And so let's start with the first step. Step 1 is really just identifying those concepts. Concepts X, Y, Z, and that's just to represent whatever number of concepts that you wish to address for a particular course. It may just be 1, it may be 2 or 3, it may be more than that you all want to link together. So the XYZ is just representing some number of concepts, at least 1 to as many as you wish to link together within an effect. And step 2 then is, once you've identified those concepts, how can you link those concepts to active learning modules? And in the framework here, it identifies X, Y, Z, and I want to be careful to explain that that does not intend to mean that concept X must be mapped to active learning module X. That doesn't have to be the case. For example, you may have one particular concept in mind that's a particularly challenging or complex one, and you want multiple active learning modules to teach that concept. So you may have one concept X and 2 or 3 active learning modules that are associated with that. Vice versa, you might identify 2 or 3 concepts that somehow you can integrate all into one active learning module, where they can learn about how those concepts link together with just one presentation, one form of active learning. So keep that in mind, that this is not intended to be a one-to-one mapping here. It's just that you're identifying concepts and then associating them with whatever the appropriate active learning modules are. And those can constitute a lot of different approaches, hands-on, minds-on kinds of opportunities for student learning in the classroom. And most importantly with this really is an iterative process. And so as you identify a concept and then you start working through an active learning module, you may decide after using it once in the class that there are things that need to be changed or altered about that active learning module. Maybe you tried to do something hands-on that just wasn't quite appropriate, maybe for the size of class or whatever the case may be, and you need to change that. So it's really intended to be sort of an iterative, cyclical process of mapping, if you will, concepts to active learning modules. So this is sort of the first important stage of development, is the link between the concepts and the active learning. Once that has been assembled, the next step then is to think about those concepts that you've identified. What kind of application can you put those under? So I'll give you an example for one that I developed. So I developed an effect that I call levy reconstruction. And the intent with this effect was to introduce students to some very basic concepts about soils. So soil types, that there are different types of soils, sands and clays, for example, which have very different behaviors, which is why I want students to understand that there are different soil types. And importantly about that is that these are particulate materials, and so they have very unique behavior compared to, say, solid materials, solid bodies. And so I want students to understand some of those fundamental properties, for example, density. So the weight-volume relationships for a particulate material like soil are very dependent on the structure of the soil. So understanding the porous space between particles, and that's very different from solid bodies. And so I want to introduce students to those concepts of soil density because of its particulate nature, and then how you can change the density through the addition of, for example, energy, right? You can compact a soil. So those are the concepts that I wanted addressed, and then I linked active learning opportunities with those. But altogether, I wanted to put those under an umbrella of some real application. So in my case, it's levees. So reconstructing a levee, you're going to build a new levee or rebuild a levee, and you need to know things about soil types, soil density, how compaction affects soil density, and I can link all of that under the umbrella of rebuilding a levee. So that's my real application. So that's what I mean by coming up with an application. So that's our third step in the process. Step 4 now is taking that application, which is somewhat generalized, right? In my case, I want to rebuild a levee. Now I can put that in some real context. So if I go back to my example, I was using levee reconstruction in post-Katrina New Orleans. So after Hurricane Katrina had wiped out or damaged a number of the levee systems in New Orleans. Of course, at that time, there was a lot of discussion about those failures and how to properly rebuild those levees. And so that's the context that I wanted to give students is you're working in New Orleans and you're charged with being the engineers to rebuild these. And so it's taking that application and really putting it in a setting that should resonate with students. So that's what we mean by the context. So taking a real application and now giving it some interest and value and meaning for students by, in my case, using a real example of a problem that had occurred in New Orleans. So that's the fourth step. And when you identify that context, now you can really think about what's the question, what's the overarching or driving question that you want to ask students. So in my case, in my example, the context, of course, is I'm charging these students to think about rebuilding levees in New Orleans. And so my question is, how much soil do you need to rebuild a particular segment of a levee system? So I give them specifically a 100-foot long section of a levee. How much soil do they need to build that new segment? And so that's the question that they'll need to think through what they need to know in order to answer that question appropriately. And so that question directly links to the context of being in New Orleans post-Katrina. And once you have that driving question, then the fifth step, of course, is taking that driving question and prompting students to think a little more deeply about guiding questions, which should be directly linked then to the concepts that you are expecting them to learn about as they progress through this effect. So for example, when I ask the driving question about how much soil is needed to rebuild a levee in New Orleans, I'm then going to ask them some questions about, okay, well, what things do you need to know about soil in order to answer this question accurately? And that's where I'm expecting them, or hoping, that they will think about, well, I need to think about the soil type that I'm going to use for this earth structure. How am I going to compact that to construct this embankment or levee? And so really those concepts are linking to those guiding questions. And then all of that collectively, the context, the driving question, and the guiding questions, are your decision worksheet. And so ultimately, that becomes the first thing that you hand out to students when you start in effect. But in terms of the development, really it becomes the final stage, if you will, of creating this effect from the foundation of concepts, and then building upon those concepts to create a decision worksheet for them to progress through. And so that's your fifth and final step, is creating this decision worksheet. And so that gives you some guidance on the developmental framework. And that's the end of this piece. Thank you.